I would like to welcome all of you here this evening and thank you all very much for coming. This is a very respectable audience for a very busy time of year, so thank you. We are truly thrilled and honored to welcome Don Domanski to the Killam Library this evening. Don is modest to a degree, so I promise I'm not going to make a fuss about the Governor General's Award. I'm just going to say congratulations on behalf of everyone here. And also, I have to tell you something wonderful Don said in the media frenzy following his award win. This was in some, I can't remember which interview this was, there was like a million of them, but he was asked, of course, so what does it mean to have won the Governor General's Award for a poet? And he said, well, something to the effect that the poems really don't know anything about this. And I just thought, what a wonderful thing to say. And it says so much, Don, about who you are as a poet. And I can't imagine anybody else putting it in quite that way, which is probably quite typical. So let's find out more about who Don is as a poet and what his poems really know. We are privileged to have another superb poet here to introduce Don tonight. Please join me in welcoming Brian Bartlett.
You hadn't forewarned me that I was supposed to explain what the poems really know. I don't know. I don't.
You're supposed to understand.
I am not going to. I'm not going to walk the plank and claim that I can possibly do that. About over 30 years ago now, the House of Anansi Press in 1975 published Don's first collection. And it's funny, just today was the first time it occurred to me how appropriate it was that the first book came out from a press called Anansi, which, as many of you know, is the name of an African spider god. It's as if that was an early sign of some of Don's interests that include spiders and gods and ants and flies and mice and bats and sparrows, but also some big things too, like whales and dragons and bears. If you look at the titles of his books, Cape Breton Book of the Dead, Heaven, War in an Empty House, Hammer Stroke, Wolf Ladder, Stations of the Left Hand, Parish of the Physic Moon, Earthly Pages, All Our Wonder Unavenged, you'll notice that there's no other poet in the country that these titles would have been created by. I think it's Don's individuality is evident right off the bat in just a mere listing of these titles. And you can see in those titles the very broad stretch of his imagination, the fertility of his making of metaphors, the underpinning of various religious traditions. And you get death, you get war, you get conflict, you get ascensions and descensions with the wolf ladder, you get animal nature, earthly pages, you get the sinister in the original meaning of the word with the left hand, and you get the lunar in in the Physic Moon, and then you get the wondrous in the title of the most recent book. Now I'm glad my next paragraph is kind of gone, because it included actually that knows nothing, which struck me the same way that it did you, that the poems know nothing of the awards and so on. And it's often obligatory to mention the awards, but I think for readers, the poetry's value really transcends any kind of public declaration of its worth, and it has its own priceless value. Don, for the last 30 years, has been moving along a poetic path, and there have been changes along that path. For instance, these aren't absolute changes, but there's been overall a kind of transformation from using shorter lines to longer lines some of the time, changes from single metaphors to a more frequent use of multiple metaphors. Also a change from, perhaps, if you look at the first 2 or 3 books, more condensed syntax into a much more wandering and wide-ranging kind of syntax. And then also a much more energetic use of long, spacious structures and long poems, as opposed to the more miniaturist sensibility that went behind the first book. And in conjunction with this poetic path, there's also been a philosophical or spiritual path. But even while using this word, this is one of the words that can be kind of troublesome. because the word path can suggest that there's some kind of destination or an end, but I don't think in reading Don's work that you really have that sense that there's going to be a culmination or a conclusion or anything. And I think rather than a path, a more appropriate metaphor, more appropriate adjective might be something like encompassing, or to use an adjective like oceanic, I think is better for to the sort of the ocean rather than the path is maybe a more accurate way of trying to talk about the work. And then I'll mention one other pet peeve I have about some discussions of Don's work. You'll often find in commentaries and blurbs words like dark and shadowy and nocturnal and so on. And it is true enough that, and it's understandable enough that these words are used sometimes to describe the poetry, because it is poetry that has plenty of sort of midnight meditators and moonlit creatures and so on. But you only have to look at, for instance, the title poem of the most recent book, All Our Wonder and Unavenged, to see that there are also human and animal figures who we experience at the height of day. And I think that when we read his work, we find that it's very much poetry that's not only for the dark or for the night, but it's also for the light and for the morning and the noon and the afternoon. Could you please welcome Don Domanski?
I don't do introductions to poems. I see no point to it, so I just read. Drowning water. The cormorant carries the universe. It's a place small enough for a bird to carry. On its back, the countryside tilts down to the sea. Beneath its feathers, a well runs deeply down into its body. You haul water up in a tin bucket. The water isn't red like cormorant's blood, but clear like the skill of drinking from your palms, folded. Holding an invisible cup, you drink the cup and unfold your hands, reaching for the water again. You take the water indoors. It enters a room trembling. It enters a house afraid, even though it's been there before, even though it's been in the belly of a whale, in a teapot, in the eyes of Seneca, in a shot glass, in a glacier, even though it's passed through sewers and aquariums, been under Phoenician ships, and in the stems of roses, in the wings of locusts rising from a decision in the dark. It enters the house shivering as if it were cold, even though it has been mixed with blood, with soup, with earth, with food dyes that made it bluer than blue ever wanted to be, even though Lao Tzu slept with it beneath his tongue, calling it a flame. Even though it has rested in the warmth of countless breaths, awaiting the child foretold by emptiness, although each time the infant is only water and mourning, the ocean come back from death, lying down its head. At every moment, water is finished with itself, complete with memories, with motion, with resting places, but because of you, it begins again to move the hours into position. It picks you up once again from sleep. All day it will protect you from thirst, which is the voice of the enemy in your throat longing to speak, to curse the wisdom of the elements, the raindrops' preeminence over humanity, the rapture in the plumbing, ecstasy in the kettle, the exaltation in the cloud. You who are so graceless, drowning water with your gestures, understand its patience, its tender stillness in a bowl. Its true life is the silence that is always present, the far away in an animal's mouth, the dowry of a bride unborn. You who are so unconscious, so wet with thought, know when you leave it will wait for you, wait years for you to return. Then it will be a name to remember when you open the door. Water, a name for your name to return to. Campfire. When I make a campfire, the forest learns my poverty, my penury here on earth. The match flares, and it's like going home after trying to find your place in the world and failing miserably. I sit waiting for night. It nears to the verge, down on all fours, and familiar with no one but God. It comes slowly to the trees, like a black dog turning its head from side to side, like a seeing-eyed dog without its owner, still showing blindness a way through the world. A hummingbird heart beats 1,260 times a minute. This man will sit in his chair till sunrise. It's been a long day. And now the conversations of the day separate the blades of grass to lie down. Now the pauses between words possess everything. The diligence of emptiness, knowing no end that he can see. Ecstasy of blank spaces between the stones and all thoughts out of the stones, allowed to wander till morning. There's a sadness about him that he can't interpret, like streamlets carrying strokes of blood back to a source it doesn't understand, like all the little sibyls under the floorboards that can't speak a word, and the books on the shelves that can't read themselves. In this room, only the hummingbird understands, pressed between the pages of a family Bible in the 1850s, like a rose that understood flight, pushed flatly, woefully, against all the words of God. The flower with the darkness, a flower where the darkness gathers in the shape of a bird, where death gathers 1,260 times a minute. That's enough sorrow for even a man to understand, to find his place, the weight of his unhappiness, that feather falling inside himself, where there are no wings, no flying into light, not a flutter, no answers coming from motion. Untitled with invisible ink. I know a world, excuse me, I'm gonna have a drink here actually. I can get it. Untitled with invisible ink. I know a word, there I go again. I know a wood where each leaf is the distance between two dark towns, where each branch contains what is granted to kingdoms. And I know the wind that carries all of that away. I know a tree in that wood and a stone in that wood, because we have sat for long hours, and together we have the energy of a shaken man. The energy I wouldn't have seated just by myself. I know a house at the edge of that wood, a small house with a woman whose heart is saddened in slow motion, broken in places that blood doesn't know. I've heard her weeping through the crickets and the vetch, because they carry what is hidden out into the world. I've heard the sound of silk in her throat when she struggles for words, and the sound of firelight spreading across water while she's sleeping. I've seen her up close and I've seen her far away, and I've seen her hands adjust that distance with emotion. She wrote this small poem in her small house, but she doesn't know. She wrote it with whatever is akin to breathing, sighs and breath against the panes, the fog that rolls out of that original ocean, fathoms down in the body. I know those waters, those covering waves, the fish that carry the language true. We come from there with our words and our deeds, all the thin trailings of what is left unspoken. The light down there is like a small house lit by a candle, just enough brightness to read by, to write by with invisible ink, enough glow to allow for the soul to go further than the fingertips, to bend over the answers and hesitate, to pick up the pen which isn't there. Our little boat drifting, a blindness along the surface of the water, the dead sitting there in the dark, our little boat drifting, our eyes shut, our mouths closed. We will try together to never open them again. The stars are painting on walls, but the walls are very far away, and all the lands of the earth are very far away. Beneath us, the living are water, the dead are salt, and although we've tried all night, although we've tried for countless nights, we can't tell one from the other. We can't separate them with our longing. All our wonder, all our wonder unavenged. Particles of evening warm themselves in the afternoon sun. Pieces of solitude gather slowly, one under each ginkgo leaf. I sit on a rock of saddleback granite. I sit in a world of abundance. A handful of bees goes down to the river. 2 handfuls return. You deadhead the dog rose and 2 stray curs appear. You deadhead a memory and 2 more appear, longer and deeper and more alive than the last. I remember my mother seated at the kitchen window, her cat's-eyed glasses staring out into the night, trying to find divinity and divinity's reasons. My mother believed God moved the sparrows around day after day. As a teenager, I believed the sparrows moved God around, all the inexhaustible crutches he leaned upon, all the underweights of silence to find his way. Now the only God I believe in are the sparrows themselves, unaltered by my belief. Their wings contain hollow bones where a pantheon could pass through, and they do. Hunters pass through it every moment. This is how they fly, by allowing passage to Earth's beliefs, the little deities of the big thunder and the rain that falls. At my feet, ants move about, looking for a great storehouse, a little picnic, a little headhunting in the grass. They drink the dew and, as far as I know, curse nothing. I would like to curse nothing, to move about practicing quietism. Perhaps find the great storehouse, do some headhunting, stick to a regime, the discipline of a feather falling from a sparrow's back. I would like to be called out and fall to the furthest limits of the finite, to a resting place among the relativity of all attributes, which would be home surely, where I began, where I no longer dwell, feeling time and space upon me now, a little dust in my eyes. A few clouds move in, riding the intersections of ancient thought across the sky, old ideas that floated upward, Confucian dialogues, Sumerian rumors, prayers of Phallus Athena, Persian satires, Druidical ethics, not gone, not absorbed, not forgotten, just there influencing us still, carrying our lighter burdens on the clouds. From where I sit, clouds cast shadows on the flower beds, perennials along the fence that bloom like glossy photographs of themselves, bright flowers stripped from shining pages, from catalogs that never mention the plant that doesn't exist, the imagined yarrow that the mind owns, that has neither root nor stalk, leaf nor flower. All my thoughts are a divination with the arrow sticks, and a mere filament of flame, a single mouse hair burning deep in a canyon, lighting up less than an inch of dead embers, the big fire, the full consciousness having moved on immediately, traveling constantly, never resting while in nature, while under heaven's humanist regard. I've been seated here for 3 hours, I think, difficult to be sure, without a watch or a column of diminishing sand, or a dog that scratches her head at 10-minute intervals. Time is a controversial work about which no one agrees. Time's a bugger, my grandmother said, and she would know. Time's a bugger, infinitude, a fluid state without a source. Anyway, time is passing for me and my piece of granite. No point thinking about it, separating it out. Cling to unity, the Taoist said over and over, till the nettles repeated it generation to generation, till you hear it on the breeze sweeping across fields and ditches. I'd rather contemplate nettles, follow their leaves back to Culpepper's herbal, through the tonics of Hildegard of Bingen. I'd rather make nettle tea and drink to Lao Tzu, but a shadow glides by and I have to look up. A bald eagle flies over, making his way down to the river to fish the afternoon away. Collingural wing beats, time's wordless doctrine upheld and maintained. The wounds of salmon like minutes cradled in the hour's arms. Late afternoon, and the western sun door still ajar. Some hours to go before it closes, shadow hours, for the food gatherers to return to their mounds, for chickadees to follow their old ways, fables without end. Cosmology of shadows gather up the light from under hostas and azaleas, many stories to be joined into one before night comes. Only one story after the sun slips over the horizon, the one in the manifold. My face is the face of the disk. This is the deceased speaking from the Egyptian Book of the Dead, from the other side of darkness, the bright side, and its holy office trying to give us a hint, an initiation to eternity, so we might find the eternal in perceptual experience, so we might find our way in the world, and the oncoming twilight is the perfect time to find your way. So the Celts believed, that sacred in-between time, between worlds, betwixt night and day, when all crossings are possible, freeing us from duality. Dharma path, the Buddhists call it, pollen path of beauty, to quote the wisdom of the Navajo. And the bees would agree, returning once more from the banks of the river. I sit on my rock, watching dragonflies hover by, with their wings sheathed in calligraphy, listening to feral cats on the move, spreading their tantric cries, while shadows grow taller and taller like adolescent boys, and dogs bark, and I almost understand their Indo-European tongues, their slang for sex, for death, their reasons for biting their masters, for venerating the chase through the thickets, their unlimited awe, their wonder unavenged, all our wonder unavenged, all of it left hanging in the fetish shine of the moment, a longing, a bit of animal shine along our skin. They are nations, the Quran says, the animals, and I believe it, a kinship of being and knowing as deep as ours, as ancient as breath on the lips, and any meditation on it deepens our own being, humbles us before the cricket's leg and the badger's eye, and we should be humbled, fall to our knees. Then comes stillness and listening, comes with kneeling, and listening is the language of the soil, Latin of the hawkweed. So I sit quietly without moving, while buried all around me, seeds lie on their sides, longing upwards to visible air, while dusk is falling, honeymooning the shadows, darkening the medicine, the metaphysics of the grass, while microbes repeat their silent mantras to themselves, soundless and drifting, all woe begone and woken, all Buddhas of immeasurable light. Time to go indoors, drink from the glass, eat from the plate, move the pages of a book around, or watch the news sway in its cradle of light. A few stars are up, and Venus and her silks at the horizon, fresh from the underworld. A tracery of myth hammered onto her body, passing our lives night after night, where we all sit at a dark gate waiting for it to open, dreaming of lifting the latch of Morning Star and stepping through to redemption. Redemption is a dark game, someone once said, and muffled, I would add, like the whisperer inside the fox, calling to the whisperer inside the varying hair, a dark and distant game. Too distant for me as I walk to the house. The moon is rising, cabbaging light from the weeds. Full moon, full side, short of breath from the long climb. I walk, and I could sleep in it, in the footsteps, in the motion given, jewel give of the fireweed, scent give of the lilies trying to keep all of summer down. I walk and birds are settling in for the evening among the pine boughs, their small cries from tree to tree, like the voice of Protheus across his many forms. I'm done.
You've got us all under a spell. More. Thank you, Don. That was fantastic. Don has agreed to answer questions from the audience. Is that right, Don?
That is right.
Okay. Does anybody have anything that they would like to ask the poet? Yes.
Mickey, I will get you for that. Okay? You're terrible. I'm not answering that, Mickey. Forget it.
He doesn't have to answer.
No, I don't have to.
You can ask him. He doesn't have to answer.
Yeah.
What's the relationship of a sparrow and a canary? You don't have to answer that one.
No, I'm not going to. What the hell do you mean?
You really asked me that? I'm a poet.
What's the relationship between a sparrow and a canary? One doesn't work in the mines, maybe. Yeah. I don't know.
Don, I actually have a question. I was just thinking about something Brian mentioned, which I wasn't aware of myself because I haven't read your entire opus, I confess.
You have,
No.
oh my God.
Are we still talking?
No, we're not. No. Yeah.
You mentioned, Brian, that Don's poetry has changed over time from short lines to longer lines. Now, this doesn't seem like it should matter too much, but of course it does, because the meaning and the rhythm and everything of the poems change with a longer line. But I'm thinking also of you're a master of the brilliant crystalline image, you know, the falling feather, the single mouse hair burning in the canyon. I love that. Do you read Japanese poetry? How much are you influenced by haiku and Japanese?
I was early on, very much so, yeah. That and European poetry, mostly,
Okay.
yeah.
So who are your poets? Who do you read to? Yeah, okay. Another
No,
impossible.
we don't have the time. I
Yes,
really,
we do.
No, we don't. Trust me, we don't. No, I try to be influenced by as many people as I can. I mean, we're not, as I keep saying over and over again, we're not doing this. We didn't invent poetry. Every poet is standing on the shoulders of thousands of men and women who've gone on before us. So we're all, so I'm trying to be influenced. Yeah, if I read a good poet, and I want to understand why he or she can do what they do and absorb at least some of that, try to. So, it's not just, you're standing on the shoulders of thousands of men and women, but not just poets either. I mean, all kinds of people who contribute to art in general and to science as well and other things. So.
And religion and philosophy.
And religion and philosophy, yeah.
Which are important in your
Yeah.
poetry.
Mm-hmm.
How can you teach what you know? You've taught at Banff, I think. Did you tell me you had taught?
Yeah, I'm doing that now, actually. Yeah.
Okay.
Mm.
How can you possibly teach this?
You can't teach it. You encourage, you give some sense of where the poet is going and try to help point him in the direction, but you can't teach. I mean, it's nonsense. You try to help. You try to read honestly and give honest answers and try to give a sense of direction. But ultimately, as I tell them, it's their work. So, if you don't like what I say, well then ignore me. It's fine. But that's all you can do. You can't make a poet out of somebody. They are what they are or they're not. And they have to work. There's some young poets that are very good, but they're very young. So, and what happens in terms of their lives, in terms of what, they have families, they have jobs, they do things, and sometimes they just stop it eventually, So a lot of dedication is needed. It's a lifetime work. You take that on or you don't ultimately. That's it. So.
Yes.
I'm just wondering if you can say something about the balance between irony and being sentimental. I feel like I end up being, I feel like there's a
No pressure at all.
Well, I feel
Where,
it. I
where,
don't know why.
who's giving you this pressure?
I don't know. I wish I
Who?
could feel it.
Well,
But
there's none. There's none.
I think I'm concerned about being overly sentimental and then being criticized for being sentimental. And
Yeah.
how can you say something directly without being sentimental, which I think you do really well. And
Well, if you follow I mean, some people probably think some of the stuff I write is sentimental, I think. Whatever, I don't really care, but you just, if you're dealing, okay, let's say you're dealing with an emotional subject, a loss of a dear loved one, let's say that for an example, well then you're going to have to focus that in to something that is not just, you know, the kind of, we end up being children when confronted with loss. That's normal, you know. So it's like people that write sexual poems and everybody's like 13 again. It's amazing, you know. It's very hard to do. And when you're dealing with something that may smack of sentimentality, well then you're going to have to be extremely cautious of that. But you're going to have to focus the emotion in on something deeper than that. You know, there's no pressure for you to bring in irony. There's no pressure for you to be sentimental. Those pressures are ones you're giving yourself. So if you're avoiding that, then it shouldn't be a problem. But you have to be really honest. You know, you have to be your most brutal critic. You know, even then, you know, you're not going to see it all, of course. Does that answer your question?
absolutely.
Okay. Mhm.
What do you think about when you write poetry?
What do I think about?
Yeah.
Nothing. Isn't that helpful? No, I a long time ago, I learned to not pick a subject to write about because I found it too confining. And one of the problems I think when you're starting writing poetry is you feel, I'm going to write a poem, I don't know, let's say about a mountain, okay? I'm going to write that poem. It's going to be about a mountain. Now, a quarter of the way through that poem, something else might appear on the page. So I learned to sort of let go of the mountain when necessary and follow the language into something else. And then gradually what I did was I just faced a blank page. I just, you know, part of what writing is, or any art is play. You play with the language. You see where the language can take you, and the language will surprise you. And that makes a, you know, makes a huge difference in terms of the direction you're going. So if I set my mind on a particular thing, it's more than likely wouldn't work terribly well for me. I've been doing this for like 30 years, or close to it anyway. So when I see the language, when something comes up that really strikes me as having some depth or quality to it, then I try to follow. It doesn't always work, of course, but I try to follow that. And gradually I see something forming that is something that I wasn't intending, but yet it makes a world of difference. If you surprise yourself, you're probably going to surprise the reader. If you're surprising yourself, probably means that you're on the right path, as opposed to, you know, I think we talked about there about death. I mean, it's a difficult subject to write about because you have all this emotional baggage, which is, you know, fine, it's human. But when you're creating a piece of art, it's another thing entirely. So you want to see past, in a way, past your own personal sense of loss to a larger field of being. That's all. Okay, that answer it?
Yes.
Okay.
Don, I'm glad you said that about your personally being surprised by your own writing, because I find your poetry astonishing. And to me, that's one of the marks of good poetry, that it astonishes you and it opens something up in your head. It makes you see things in a different way. And I'm wondering how, when you're writing, how much are you led to those astonishments by language, and how much are you led to them by visual imagery? And are you even aware while you're writing of the difference between those two things?
Well, they're one and the same. I really do follow the language. I try to do that, and I'm kind of a frustrated painter, so I'm very visual in the way I look at things. I mean, I think if you're looking at language, one of the things you have to look at the sense of in poetry, you're really trying to get to a pre-verbal state. You're trying to move past all the cliches, which are, you know, an enormous weight on any writer, but especially on a poet. And you want to find something that strikes below the thinking level, something that is, you know, somebody once said all poetry has to be beautiful, and I guess they're right. Even the most horrible subjects in some way have a beauty to it. But you want to push past the words. You want to try to capture something. Every poem is a failure. It's bound to be. You can't capture what you feel. You can't capture what bits of reality you see. You can, you know, see the old Buddhist thing about the finger pointing at the moon. Don't get the finger confused with the moon. Well, you know, the poem is the finger. The moon is something else entirely. So it's both visual and that sense of language that makes the difference for me. It moves me. I mean, it's an emotional experience for me, and if I wasn't having that emotional experience, I wouldn't do it. You know, it's a way to get away from, in some ways, away from myself and look into something that that has more depth than my little ego. Sad as it is. So, you know, you need to, that's the point of following language. So.
Do you think that poetry, to be fully appreciated in that sense, needs to be read in the same way? It's almost in a pre-verbal. You need to shut down some of the logical paths.
Yeah, you have to. Yeah, logic is the serpent in the garden. It doesn't. Logic is very good for practical things. You know, it's very good. I think in Western societies we're made into some kind of god. That's not how we live. We live somewhere between our conscious and unconscious lives. We live in some place that is, you know, logic is part of it, but it's only part. It's not the be-all and end-all. And, you know, I mean, I've heard people talking about, you know, people's work and saying it's very accessible. And that, what does that mean? It doesn't mean much to me. I was on a Canada Council jury once, somebody said that about somebody's work, and I said, I wish I brought my grocery list. You would have loved it. So it's that kind of, I don't know, I mean, it's that kind of thing. Logic is fine. Yeah. Logic's my friend, but you know, not my God. No. Our emotional lives and our just being human beings, not, you know, it ain't that simple. It never will be.
Isn't that almost a definition of good art? Is that it does tap into that other level for us?
Good art for me is something that adds to my consciousness in an important way. I mean, a different way of looking at the world, a different way of entering the world, and that's what I use as a, you know, I mean, I guess I'm not conscious of it particularly, but that's what does it for me. If I read a new poet, I mean, it's incredibly, when I was a kid, I read a new poet, I was like excited for days and days. And I still get that way. If someone mentions a poet to me and I read them, and I still get excited like I was when I was 15. I mean, it's the same kind of thing because it adds something of immense depth to your consciousness. And you can get that, you know. When I was in New York, I went to the MoMA, and I mean, it's amazing. And just to see these paintings, and most of them I've seen, you know, in books and things, which somehow takes a little of the glamour away from it because you've seen it so many times, but when you actually stand there and look at it, it's amazing. And it does affect your consciousness. And it says there's a deeper world, another world. It's not all about commerce. It's not all about attainment. You know, I talked to students once and I said, when you go out into the world each day, see what you're thinking about that has nothing to do with your genitals or your wallet. Just that. Nothing to do, you know? So just look, be mindful, look around. You know, and very few people do it. We do it when we're young, but when we get older, we drop that. You know? So yeah. I'm not even sure what you asked.
Who cares?
Did I answer it? Sorry.
You went down a path with it. Anybody else have anything they'd like to contribute?
Okay.
Well, I'd like to thank you, Don, on behalf of everyone for a really wonderful reading, and I think you have inspired us all. Do you have a message you'd like to leave us with? Any aspiring poets in the audience who might like to take something home in a back pocket from you? Which
No.
isn't your beads?
No, not my beads. No, nobody touches my beads.
Words of wisdom.
I have
for you?
I have no words of wisdom at all.
No words.
Absolutely not.
That's all right.
Yeah.
Don, thank you very much.
Thank you.